in a Victorian kitchen. You would have been confronted with many unfamiliar utensils, of course, as well as the cooking methods, ingredients, and such that actually might be surprisingly recognizable. So the Victorian era, we generally say it lasted from 1837 to 1901, really saw significant changes in many aspects of life, and including the way people cooked and organized their kitchens. Victorian kitchens were typically functional spaces with a focus on efficiency, but they also reflected the social status and values of the time. So I'm going to provide a glimpse inside for you. Now, just a little bit about myself. Dan already had a great introduction. Thank you so much for that. These are my 3 books, like he said. And in addition to that, I've been the Victorian food expert at the Ebenezer Maxwell Mansion in Philadelphia in the Germantown section. And I highly recommend visiting there. It's a fabulous, the kitchen there is amazing. And in fact, Dan and I and the photographer from my Gilded Age cookbook took some photographs there, and that's what some of them are in these slides, the actual photographs from that kitchen. And just a brief outline of what, and this is it. So today I'm going to talk to you about pre-Victorian American cooking, give you some idea of layouts, organization, kitchen innovations, because that was a big time for that. Tools and gadgets, food preservation, formal dining, staff hierarchy, and then recipe evolution too. Now, what was American cooking like before the Victorian era? What kinds of food did people eat and why? Well, in colonial America, cooking was actually done over an open hearth. And we were just talking about that a minute ago, actually, Karen was, and they used heavy kettles and awkward fireplace tools, as you can see here, such as the pivoting crane. And it was really backbreaking work. I mean, very physical. And most of the cooking occurred at floor level. So you're stooping and it just was uncomfortable. And this was really the method until the 1820s when cast iron cook stoves were introduced. And this is arguably one of the most important kitchen inventions of the 19th century. And not only did they burn 1/3 less wood, which had been becoming increasingly difficult to find. So, I mean, that was definitely a benefit, in addition to then you didn't have to stoop anymore. And so hearth cooking, the old way, required cooks to be able to create and maintain the cooking fire too. And they used axes, shovels, tongs, pokers, along with the andirons. And the temperature control, it wasn't like you were just turning a knob like we do today. You had to actually move the pots up and down. They hung from these pot hooks or trammels suspended over iron cranes and change over the fire. And the cook would lower the pot, in and out, up and down, like if you wanted over the fire to boil things, and then just simmer, move it away. And then the baking, so you can see the bake oven on the left there, that little arched. So that's where the baking occurred, and that was built into the chimney located at the back or to the side of the hearth. And cooks had to really rearrange their schedules according to the heat of this oven. It burned the hottest when it was fired up in the morning, and then it cooled off as the day went on. So if you're baking bread, that would go in first, and then puff paste items like pies, then cakes and cookies, puddings and buns, and last they would put custards and meringues. And again, you didn't know the temperature, so cooks would just stick their hand inside the oven to let them know how hot the oven was, and they would know however many seconds it was inside, and they just got to know what was the right temperature. And just as modern cooks have their favorite types of pots and pans, there were also differing opinions throughout the 19th century about what kind of pot was best. So the sturdy, heavy-duty cast iron was really the standard for hearth cooking. I actually love cooking on cast iron myself. And most cooks had a nest of iron pots in various sizes for this purpose, as well as griddles, toasting racks, spiders. You can see one on the floor there in front of the hearth, and other small cooking vessels, again, all situated on the hearth, which was their cooking surface, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. And then cooks also, you think about water, we just go to the sink and water comes out, of the faucet, but they had to fetch water, outdoor pumps for cooking and drinking, sometimes making several trips a day. This photo from 18th century New York shows how residents got their drinking water from wooden pumps located at street corners. And then they drew water from underground springs, but sometimes it would come out really distasteful and brackish. Part of the reason why colonial people often drank beer, because it was, it wasn't polluted, and the bacteria and such was not in there. Just a couple of the street corner pumps in New York actually produced high quality refreshing water, and these special pumps became known as tea water pumps. And you can see the one on the right, because the water that came out of them they could use to make high quality tea. And now I love this market scene, but again, going to the market was so different. There was gathering food, shopping, and commerce, so much different than today. Port cities like New York and Philadelphia had numerous daily auctions of newly arrived goods. They were held right there on the dock sometimes, or the stores nearby. You could get quite a wide range of foods, believe it or not. English goods such as mustard, spices such as nutmeg and cloves. Then you could also get coffee, tea, things such as lemons and figs. And of course, high quality meats, especially like Philadelphia. We had Lancaster not far away, and fresh produce and that sort of things. But you would often go to the market, kind of like we do today with our bags, but they would have like a little crock to put the butter in, and a glass, a jar or something, a container for milk. So that's the kind of shopping that they did then. And turtle, I always have to talk about this because this was a huge 19th century food, very important at the time. East Coast cities would get regular shipments of turtle from the Caribbean, sometimes up to 3 times a week. And they were sent to the markets, kept alive in large carts, fed the whole time. And even though some private households would make them, most of the time it was large taverns, because it was such a large beast or creature. I don't want to say beast, but you know what I mean. It just produced a big amount when they would make the soup, and they often featured it at these large outdoor seating events, so people could get some soup and sit outside. And they also, it was almost like a form of takeout early on, where they would do that with turtle too. So it was kind of interesting, and this lasted through the 1800s into the Victorian era, and really through the beginning part of the next century. So it was quite popular at the time. And then as far as desserts, some of them were similar, but some were a little bit different. They did a lot of fruits, as you can see here, which would include fresh and preserved, pies and pastries, tall and other layer cakes they would make, but it would be different because they had to whip the eggs to produce a mass of air bubbles called a foam. So it was much different than just, putting in a teaspoon of baking powder or something. Now we have all these chemical leavenings. So before the Victorian times, it was really a tedious process. And if you didn't beat the eggs the right way, the cake could often have an eggy taste. It would be tough and just not pleasant. So we're going to talk about some Victorian innovations that really helped speed up that process. And now we're going to take a look inside. So at the footprint of a Victorian kitchen, this is actually a transitional kitchen, because cooking was still done on the hearth, as you can see there over the fire, but there was new technologies. They had these box stoves, as you can see in front of the fireplace, but it took some time for women to get used to them. And, often with new technologies, people can be resistant to it. So this picture dates from 1845 in a book called The American Economical Housekeeper. And so this tin kitchen in front of the hearth is also called a tin reflector oven. And it was a large spherical box placed in front of the fireplace, or even a cook stove when they came on the scene. And the other side was actually open. So the oven's metal surface reflected the heat of the fire back on the roast. So that's how the meat cooked. And it had a roasting jack or spit, convenient door on one side to catch the juices, which could be used for future cooking or to make gravy. They had bottle jacks too, that were roasting jacks, as you can see on the right, with a wind up mechanism, and then it turned the meat automatically so that it could get roasted evenly. And that it was a really, the roasting spit, this was called, really remained a fixture throughout the Victorian period. But by the 1870s, cooks had moved from the hearth level to the stovetop and countertop. I mean, that must have been such a revelation for people. They had this great work surface now. And then they also installed things like cupboards, closets, pantries. You know, you could have tools because you had more tools and ingredients, as well as fancier cookery. And all of these modern improvements really required a cook to be more educated and ambitious with cooking too. There was some degree of intuition, but as you can see on the clock next to the stove there on the wall, suggests now that there was starting to be a sense of science about cooking and timing. And mass-produced clocks actually began to appear by the 1820s and were ubiquitous by the Civil War. So then you'll start to see clocks in kitchens too, something we don't really think of either, but that was really helpful for them. Now, oh, did I skip a slide? No, I guess I do go on to this one. Yeah, okay. So Victorian kitchens were often located in the basement or the back of the house. And if any of you have ever gone to an historic house, you can kind of see that. The same, again, that Ebenezer Maxwell, it's in the back of the house. And away from the more formal areas. And believe it or not, it's because people didn't want to smell the food, which is kind of funny because now we love, oh, look, you can smell, you know, delicious aroma, but they didn't want to smell that. And kitchens were used mostly by just servants and children that were expected to be seen and not heard. And then I'm showing you a feature here, which was very common at the time, servant bells, also called house bells. And there were a system of wire and pulleys that ran throughout the house. If any of you have watched Downton Abbey, they have that in the beginning there. And then so residents could call servants depending on what room they were in. They were really prevalent in both England and America from the late 1700s to the early 20th century. And they were installed near the kitchen, in the servants' areas, and sometimes in the servants' room, so the common areas and the room. And then they had different labels to match the room. So it was kind of interesting. And then at the other end, there was this tapestry bell pull, which was a long piece of elegant fabric. It was suspended from the ceiling and decorated with a tassel. And these were usually a discreet area, you know, in a parlor or over to the side table in a bedchamber. And the family would need only to pull it once, as the pendulum would continue ringing for a while. So the servants had some time to get to where they needed to go. Now, other evidence that children use the kitchen, you can see this is a really tiny, it's a toy stove, again, is in the Ebenezer Maxwell mansion. And it's located under, if you look in the bigger picture, it's under the window there. So you can see, and they actually have a small children's table there too that it's sitting on. So that's just, I mean, it was a place for children to play too. And so here's some of the layout. I'm going to show you, I actually have a video at the end that I can show you a little bit better, but it really was to maximize efficiency. There's various workstations to do different tasks. So they did have a sink with running water at this point. So you could wash off produce, fill pots, do dishes. They had the stove for cooking, which actually had multiple burners. It was fabulous. An ice box for perishables, and then that central work table where you could, you know, do food preparation. And then here's some of the storage. They often had large dressers, cabinets, pantries. They also had hooks to store, utensils, to hang things, and then little shelving areas as well. They also, Victorian kitchens were also decorative, featuring tiles, patterned wallpaper, ornate light fixtures. The aesthetic was really influenced by the Victorian fascination with Gothic, Renaissance, and other historical styles. So you often see that in a Victorian kitchen as well. And now I wanted to talk about some innovations. I already said previously how cooking was done using a range of methods, including open fires, coal or wood burning stoves, and then later gas stoves. But really, this cast iron range in the mid 19th century revolutionized cooking. It provided more consistent and controllable heat. That was the main difference there. And they could be fueled by wood or coal and made cooking easier because the work surfaces, again, were at that waist level. By the 1850s, really, it was only rural families and, in more remote areas that continued with that, more fireplace, hearth cooking. So the cook stove really, even pre-Victorian era had taken over. The cast iron stove shown here was for cooking and heating the water. The picture on the left, you see that long copper hot water boiler there. So it was also used to heat water. And one important outcome of the shift from fireplace to stove cooking was that multiple items could be cooked more easily at once too. So ordinary family menus could become more complex, involving more courses and recipes that were a little bit more complicated. And the stove cooking required cooks to acquire some new skills. So learning the proper way to open and close the stove's dampers and flues to control the temperature. It really, you could make a Charlotte Russe, at the same time that you were doing, like veal cutlets with white sauce, that kind of thing. And you can start to see this on menus where you could really, put a whole meal together. It was much more easier, and you had all these other surfaces to work with too. Now, I've kind of touched on this briefly, but another life-changing invention was the adoption of these newfangled leavenings that began to be used as rising agents in the 19th century, such as pearl ash, and then baking soda and baking powder, and even other other rising agent, but these are the main ones. And it was baking powder that really was the main life-changing ingredient for cooks to make cakes. Quick breads became more popular. It was, these sky-higher layer cakes, you'll see them, as well as things like sponge cake, could be produced with much less effort. The advertisement shown in the middle, you can see it's just one example of the plethora of trade cards that promoted this ingredient. And they also referred to it often as a nutritive yeast powder. So it was just everywhere. People were really adopting to this new ingredient. And then recipes for baked goods that formerly called for eggs and yeast to make them rise replaced the traditional ingredients with this new time-saving substance. And you can see it just promoted by all different companies. And it was a new era in cookbook, in baking, and many recipes had to be restructured to incorporate this new substitute. But some cookbook writers, like Eliza Leslie, would warn if too much was used, it would impart a disagreeable taste. So you have to think about it is a chemical, and they were just still refining it. And, you didn't want that chemical taste in your baked goods. So, but ease of use usually won over, and women would use it anyway, especially when a recipe such as milk biscuits would normally call for kneading the mixture for 40 minutes. So these really run out over time. And then another kitchen innovation that we kind of take for granted is baking chocolate, actually. Chocolate cake and other desserts are really such a staple in our culture now. It's hard to imagine them not being available. But prior to the Victorian era, chocolate was mainly consumed as a drinking beverage. In fact, the earliest recipes labeled chocolate cake were actually intended for enjoying alongside hot chocolate and contained no chocolate at all. It was because chocolate was difficult to process. They had it, it just was, it, it wasn't until a Dutchman by the name of Van Houten actually patented a way to simplify cacao processing by pressing most of the fat out and alkalizing the dry cocoa that remained. So this really changed the game for the way that chocolate could be incorporated into different desserts. And you start to see this in all these period cookbooks of the time. And powdered gelatin is another thing that was a huge innovation. What we think of today as Jello or this Knox plain gelatin, because they had a lot of these decorative molded dishes at the time, both in sweet and savory format throughout the Victorian era. So when they invented powdered gelatins, it made it so much easier. Referred to as aspic jellies. The technique was based on this lengthy process in which you had to make a thick gelatinous stock from animal products that were rich in this natural gelatin, such as veal knuckle, calf's feet, poultry bones, that sort of thing. And you had to boil the stock, skim it, clarify it, all of that. But when they invented these powdered gelatins, you just opened the packet, added hot water, cold water, and it gelled. So it was so much faster and easier and less messy too. So you can see some of these jelly desserts that I'm talking about too. They had different molds, such as all oval rounders, like the cylinders, different designs. You can see like just some of them are just like these really, they're modeled on nobility, or they liked to do things in like Roman gods shapes and all kinds of things. They had special molds that could produce layers within layers. It really was quite amazing. And the most elegant dishes were literally put on a pedestal, as you can see with some of them here. And it really allowed more room for fancy garnishes too. And now I want to talk a little bit about the importance and functionality behind Victorian kitchen tools and gadgets. So many were labor-saving devices, including the rotary egg beater shown here, which was patented in the 1860s, with others following in quick succession. It was the Dover Stamping Company that emerged in the 1870s as the best known manufacturer of the device. And they, called the Dover. It came in a wide variety of sizes, and it could be for households or families and even hotels. Like they had different sizes and formats and all that kind of thing. So by the 1880s, there were many different types of egg beaters on the market, and all of them would have been a revelation to cooks because, again, they had to previously beat everything by hand. It could take an hour to make it, beat the eggs enough for a cake, and it was often delegated to a servant. So I'm sure any of the cooks and servants at the time were so happy to have this new device on the scene. And this was particularly important in making sponge cake because before they had these chemical rising agents, they needed to beat the eggs and sugar for a long time. So again, such a tedious process, but this new gadget could make these sponge cakes in much less time. And it was a very popular treat to have for different events. And now apples too, I have to talk about apple peelers because apples were a very important food in the Victorian age. But preparing the apples for baking, which includes peeling, coring, quartering, slicing, it was very time consuming. And even though mechanical devices to pare apples were around since 1804, many used a small knife through the 19th century, and that's how they, would prep an apple. But apples really took off. They were planted throughout the U.S., and patents for apple parers really flooded the market after 1850. And also, they had devices to pare potatoes, peaches, as well as removing cherry pits. So, like all these fruits and vegetables that needed to be prepared to cook or bake, it was really important to have something that was making your life easier. They also had these iron table mounted lathes, which is a machine that they rotate about a horizontal axis and shaped by a fixed tool. So it was like a gear driven rotary crank turned paring mechanism, and it could rotate the fruit, peel off the skin, and cut it into long spiral sections. So that could be good for pies and applesauce, that kind of thing. And potatoes, another really important Victorian staple food. Particularly, they had these Saratoga chips, which is the precursor to the potato chips that we all know and love today. And it was a Saratoga Springs, New York restaurant called Moon's Lake House that made them really popular. And by the 1870s, recipes for Saratoga chips really started to appear frequently in American cookbooks. And as a result, devices emerged to chop potatoes into these paper thin slices. They were even called the Saratoga potato parer and slicer, which cost 75 cents in 1881. So that was another life-changing device. Also, meat, devices to grind or mince meat was very popular. They had things like mince pie, Salisbury steak, meatloaf, all those sort of things. So early versions had a tub with chopping blades that a cook could crank up and down to automate chopping. There's catalog testimonials from the 1880s that state that these devices could cut a task that formerly took 1 to 3 hours of tedious labor into just 5 to 15 minutes, and further touted that they were so easy to use that a child of 6 years of age could operate one. Well, maybe not, we wouldn't say that today, but that's, back in the Victorian times. And later meat grinders followed the same principle as apple peelers, with the meat going through a hopper at the top. So by changing the cutting blade, a cook could change the consistency of the meat setting. And now I'd like to discuss some Victorian food preservation methods. So, food preservation was really crucial because they didn't have the, refrigerators that were electric and kept everything so cold or even frozen for a long period of time. They had ice boxes, and as a result, ice was an important commodity. And improvements in the ice harvesting business in the 1820s and 30s really made it more profitable. But it could be messy too. You had to get a block of ice, and there was a drip pan on the bottom, because the ice would melt throughout the day. It usually only lasted one day, and then it was emptied, and then the new ice was added. So although throughout the 19th century they were simple and inefficient, it really changed the ability to have ice year round if you had an ice box. And by 1840, Eliza Leslie, who's a cookbook writer, she described them as conveniences no family should be without. By the 1880s, the launch of cooling systems based on absorption and condensation were game changers for keeping things chilled. And in the 1890s, electric freezers and other equipment were introduced, although many didn't take off till the early part of the 20th century. So also with all these improvements in ice harvesting, you could have ice cream at home. And American Nancy Johnson invented an ice cream freezer for home use in 1843, which really made it more available to have, outside an ice cream parlor. You could have it in your home now, and make it in your home. So that was another thing that really kind of changed the game in a lot of ways for desserts. And now fruits too. Fruits have seasons, and serving them fresh wasn't always possible depending on the time of year. So many fruits were fragile; they could spoil easily. So before they had such good refrigeration, shipping and storing them could be difficult. There were some alternatives, such as placing citrus fruits stalk and down in a vessel full of sand for cold storage. Things like apples could keep fairly well all winter in a root cellar. But another way to enjoy fruits year round was to preserve them in sugary syrup. Eliza Leslie recommended or described how to preserve fruits such as crab apples, cranberries, gooseberries, pineapple, strawberries, and even pumpkin. So the fruits were pared and cored or pitted and then cut in half. And whoops, I didn't mean to go on to the next one. And then they quartered it and sliced. So the fruit, was prepared before, then it was boiled and such. Things like peaches could be preserved whole. You would peel them first and then use a skewer to push out the pit. And then they were boiled until tender in a preserving kettle. Sometimes flavorings such as lemon, cinnamon, or brandy, which also served as a preservative too, were added. And they would add the juice that was remained from the boiling was strained and combined with sugar, and the general rule was a pound of sugar per pound of fruit. Then the fruit was put back in the kettle, boiled until they had a juicy syrup, a very thick, syrup. And then they would transfer this to glass jars, the syrup poured over top. When it was cool, they would take a sheet of paper that had been dipped in brandy and then lay it on top to form a seal between the preserves and the lid. And sometimes the underside of the paper was coated with egg white, which helped create a tighter seal, actually keeping out air and insects from getting in. There's Mrs. Webster. She was the author of The Improved Housewife, recommended checking on the preserved fruit often to see that it does not ferment. She said if this does happen, then you can pour off the syrup, boil it, and then add it back to the jar while still hot. One invention that was also, the same time frame that really helped with preserving was the glass fruit jar that was invented by John Mason. Now, this really revolutionized fruit and vegetable preservation, making the task much easier for home cooks. Because it had a self-sealing screw-on zinc lid that was patented in 1858, and then a rubber gasket between the lid and glass and ensured that tight seal. And then you didn't have to worry about it going bad or anything getting in there, or whatever. And by the 1860s, these jars were shipped throughout the United States. Now, crystallizing was another method that they used, where they would extract the juice of fruits and replace it with sugar syrup. It was really like a time-consuming process involving boiling the fruit, making a sugar syrup, and then covering it to allow it to absorb the sugar. When it was fully fermented, it was removed from the syrup and rinsed with water. And then it could be either glazed, dipped in a thick sugar syrup and left to quickly harden, or crystallized, so dipped in the same type of syrup, but cooled and hardened slowly. This would cause the sugar covering the fruit to crystallize. So you can see up here at the top, there's some crystallized fruits there. Now, fruits were also made into marmalade, jams, and jellies. That was taking fruit pulp combined with sugar and boiled down to a chunky, firm, spreadable consistency. This sugar ratio was similar to preserved fruit, but cooks were often advised against using too much sugar, which would cause the mixture to crystallize. But if not enough was added, it would quickly ferment. So you had to have that balance there. And you can see these are ads for, there were just so many different preserves and jellies at the time that were commercialized. Another popular method to help fruits and vegetables last longer was pickling. Um, and most of the time it was vegetables that were brined and marinated in vinegar. Spices, the amount of vinegar and sugar varied depending on the taste preference in each recipe. Cucumbers or other vegetables were often layered in a glass or crock type dish and then set in a brine of salt, vinegar, water, and spices for a specified time. It could range from 24 hours up to even 20 or more days and required a very cool environment. So most of the time they were put in a basement or a very cool part of the kitchen. Another thing that was popular in the early part of the Victorian era were catsups, however you want to pronounce it. But they were very interesting preserved seasonings that cooks could use in recipes. They were like salty, spicy liquids, thinner than the tomato ketchup that we think of today, more like a soy sauce. And there were versions made from walnuts, mushrooms, cucumbers, lemons, and lobster, as well as grapes and tomatoes. And the common features, they had the salty taste, concentrated consistency, and a long shelf life. So it was a way to flavor foods. You didn't have to worry about refrigerating them. It just added that little oomph to a lot of different recipes. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about formal dining at home. It really increased in both the upper and middle classes during the Victorian era. Wealthier Victorian households typically employed a staff of servants, including cooks, maids, and scullery maids, to assist with kitchen tasks and serving meals. A successful, elaborate Victorian meal really depended on the services of well-trained domestic help. Although you could get people hired for special occasions, about 25% of all households in 1880 employed at least one servant. And the increase in the number in middle-class households was really due to the growth of more elaborate domestic rituals, especially those related to food. Servants provided most of the labor to enable these elaborate dinner parties and other events, allowing middle-class women more freedom to emulate the rituals and manners of the wealthy, knowing that they had adequate support from domestic help. In the 1858 book, Domestic Receipt Book, Catherine Beecher described how it was necessary to have servants for even a simple dinner party for 10, stating that the dinner party may be got up and carried through comfortably by a housekeeper if she is provided with an experienced cook and well-trained waiter. So, she was saying without these, it's absolute cruelty for a husband to urge or even allow his wife to go through the toil, anxiety, and effort needed for such an affair. So it was just, this is the way it was then, to have the servants helping. It was more than a hostess could manage on her own. And the hierarchy in the kitchen itself was well defined, with the head cook overseeing the operation. In a large household, the kitchen maid was always the first to get up in the morning. She would clean the stove, fire it up, get it ready for the day's cooking, scrub the floor, all those sorts of things. Since cleaning in the kitchen was really an ongoing, difficult activity. And the pay for the cook was just a few $100s a year, although cooks in wealthy households were at the high end of the scale and usually treated quite fairly well. As a good cook was difficult to come by and to retain, because poaching one cook, from one social circle was not uncommon. If you had a really good cook, somebody else might want to try to hire them away from you, kind of thing. And cooks, when you hired a cook, they would have their own collection of personal recipes in tow. The woman of the household would choose from among them to create her menus. And the cook had to manage all of the suppliers and food storage, preservation, in an icebox that didn't have a huge amount of space. So she had to figure all of that out and manage it. In middle class households, many times the ladies managing a house had little experience directing servants and often treated them and paid them rather poorly. In these cases, cooks would typically ask if they could choose the grocer, butcher, etc., and ask them to mark up their prices, keeping the difference. So they had their own ways of getting around not being treated so well. Now, women usually looked for servants that were over 30 years old because they were considered more stable and less likely to quit. Other desirable qualities included cleanliness, good character, and the ability to perform household tasks efficiently and ideally invisibly. During a meal, servants were expected to be able to perform all their duties without speaking at all, following the specific instructions that they were given beforehand. So they had this whole kind of protocol to things. The woman of the house would create detailed plans outlining the courses and table settings, including how and when the roast was carved, plated, and served, and where each item would be placed on the table. Servants would clear between courses and then bring in the next one. At the completion of each course, the maid, waiter, or butler would remove all the dishes, plates, and silver, replace pitchers of water, clean wine glasses and tumblers. Then they would brush the crumbs from the table, set the table for dessert. They were also responsible for carving and serving food from the sideboard and then distributing plates to the guests. They served with the left hand and cleared with the right. So there was this whole, again, protocol that they followed. And now I want to talk a little bit about the evolution of recipes. So this was the time frame too where recipe clarity and consistency really began developing throughout the total of the 19th century. In the beginning of the Victorian era, many recipes were still written in a paragraph format. And they often had these, measurements such as heaped teaspoons, pinches of seasoning, wine glasses of liquid, and butter the size of an egg. So these sample recipes shown here are kind of transitional because they have measurements such as butter the size of an egg and coffee cup, as well as tablespoons, which is, something now it's a standard. In addition, the cookware industry didn't offer standard measuring equipment until the late 19th century. So it was often difficult for home cooks to correctly duplicate ingredient quantities because maybe your wine glass is a little different size than mine, and what's an egg size. So it was just really, I think a lot of cooks just did it by looking at things and just knowing, how the measurements would be. Now, cookbook writer Eliza Leslie, she wrote a total of 9 cookbooks between 1827 and 1857. She really began to list ingredients at the beginning of her recipe and stress the importance of accurate proportions. And this was a lesson she learned from her classes at Mrs. Goodfellow's cooking school. Some of you may have heard me talk about her several times since that was my first book, and I learned a lot about how cooking schools were back then and how important Mrs. Goodfellow was really to cooking in general. And she passed this all on to Eliza Leslie. And so Eliza began to feature a guide to both liquid and dry weights and measures in the beginning section of her cookbooks. And by 1851, she would state in Directions for Cookery that accuracy in proportioning ingredients is indispensable, and therefore scales and weights and tin measures are of utmost importance. So as you can see this kitchen scale here, and it really became more commonplace and accepted that you needed to really standardize recipes to make them succeed, and for cookbooks to be able to people to use them and have successful recipes. Now, as cook stoves took over throughout the mid-1800s, some cookbooks advised using copper vessels, especially for large joints such as beef, rump roast, and ham because they regulated the heat better. But copper had a disadvantage in that pots made out of this material needed to have a durable tin lining to prevent lead from leaching into the food. For this reason, Eliza Leslie did not recommend copper and adamantly stated if copper vessels are used in a kitchen, they should be well tinned on the inside and will require new tinning at least once a year, or even more frequently if the tin appears to be wearing off. Now, the style of cooking utensils Miss Leslie did recommend were those lined with porcelain, even though she warned lining could crack and flake off if used over too high of a heat. She still felt that they were more wholesome and more easily kept clean than any other cooking utensils and would last for many years with the proper care. But pots and pans made out of tin were probably the most popular, especially in smaller households, such as this material was often deemed the lightest, safest, and most economical. A brand new tin saucepan was about the same price as tinning a copper one, so you have to think of it that way too. And then later in the Victorian era, it was Boston Cooking School instructor Fanny Farmer who really began a crusade to develop clear, concise recipe instructions with level measurements by volume that we are so familiar with today. Although she has been referred to as the mother of level measurements due to her persistent quest for accuracy, this is a title that's often disputed among historians. Mary Lincoln, who was Fanny Farmer's Boston Cooking School predecessor, featured detailed explanations emphasizing the science of cookery, proper measurements, and specific ingredient descriptions in her cookbook, what to do and what not to do in cooking. And even though this cookbook was really hailed as revolutionary and became extremely popular at for both cooking schools and the general public, farmers still found fault with it. And she felt that the directions were insufficient and a number of the recipes lacking. So it was her obsession with precision that led her to revise and elaborate on Lincoln's version with the objective of ensuring easy recipe directions and standardizing measurements once and for all. So the result of her hard work was the Boston Cooking School Cookbook, a massive 831-page cooking reference manual that was published in 1896. So she was a crusader for this kind of way to standardize things. And now we're nearing the end, but I wanted to show you, this is a video that I took at Ebenezer Maxwell, where I kind of walk around the kitchen. There's no sound, I'll talk over it, but just to show you kind of what the inside of a Victorian kitchen looks like. Before I start, you can see at the top of the door, those the servant bells there. And then I'll just start playing it, and you can see I walked around the kitchen. There's the clock that I mentioned before, how clocks were standard. And then the cabinets, you can see the scale, all the utensils there hanging up or on shelves, the sink, the workstation in the middle, that's a sugar cone on the table, the apple or meat grinder there, you know, the rotary egg beater. They have a really nice kitchen sink there. You can see some trays and even a little lamp, bottles that would have been some of the ketchup bottles. There's the workstation, coffee grinder, and then over to the stove. That's the boiler on the right there. And that's where they would have stored eggs and things like that on that cupboard. And then all the mason jars there. They have a really good collection of mason jars on the wall. Is a little bell, it's a dinner bell. And then the window is shuttered at the time. So that's what they, you know, there were shutters over the windows. So you could even see that in the kitchen. And then, and then just to close things out, this is the cookbook that Dan was talking about that we worked together on, and now we're working on one that's going to be a Christmas version. So, it's just so fascinating to find out what the differences are between then and today, and but also to see what's similar and what's kind of stuck, right? Like, and how people take to innovations. So, it's sometimes it takes time, other times they catch on right away. So, thank you all for joining me today. I will stop sharing and
Well, thank you
happy to
very
take
much,
any
Becky.
questions. Sure.
Um, it was quite a fascinating. Um, I
I
know,
know I covered a lot.
but I
Sure.
learned a lot. I learned some other things today,
Yeah.
which is really interesting. If
Yeah.
anybody does have any questions, I don't see any in the chat room right now. Go ahead and feel free to put them in there if you do. It's a very nice, thorough presentation.
Thanks. Yeah, Barbara, actually, the I have to submit the cookbook by December, and then it'll come out next December. It takes that long for them to put everything together, especially all the photography and that sort of thing. So it also come out, I guess, in fall of 2025. So, and you can look for more of Dan's fabulous food styling, just to give Dan another round of applause for his in the Gilded Age cookbook, how he won for the crown roast of lamb. He won an IACP cookbook award, which was just so fabulous.
Thank
And
you.
I told him that when they put it up on the screen, everyone oohed and awed, and I'm not kidding. It was cool. So
Well, thank you.
yeah.
All righty. If
Other
we don't have any
questions? Yeah.
questions, we did a very thorough job. I look forward to seeing everybody on November 2nd in historic Falsington. And with that, I thank you all for participating and see you very, very soon. Thank you, guys.
Good night, everyone. Thanks so much.